The prairie wind blew across the dusty town of Red Rock, carrying with it the sound of laughter from the saloon porch. A group of ranch hands leaned against the wooden posts, their boots caked in mud, their faces red with drink and mischief. They had spent the day scheming a joke so cruel that even the rough men of the frontier would whisper about it later. Her name was Nayeli. She was Apache, no more than 17, her dress torn and faded, her dark hair braided with simple beads. She had been living in the margins alone, poor, abandoned by her people after her family perished in a raid. The ranch hands saw her vulnerability, and in their drunken cruelty, they decided to make her the center of their entertainment. "Take her to Carson," one of them slurred, grinning wide. "Tell him she's his new bride. Let's see how the tough cowboy handles a wife he never asked for." They all roared with laughter, as if the fate of a living, breathing girl was nothing more than a poker hand tossed on the table. By the time the sun began to sink, Nayeli found herself standing outside a ranch house at the edge of the open plains. The home belonged to William Carson, a man known for his solitude. A veteran of the Indian Wars, Carson was tough, silent, and carried his past like a shadow no one dared disturb. When Carson opened his door that evening, what he saw was not the prank his so-called friends intended, was a girl, trembling, clutching her shawl against the biting wind. Eyes filled with fear and shame. Carson frowned. "What in God's name is this?" The ranch hands chuckled from their saddles a few yards away. One called out, "She's your bride, Carson. Apache girl, delivered right to your doorstep. Thought you could use some company out here." The laughter cut through the cold air like a whip. Carson's jaw tightened. He had fought men like them before, men who thought cruelty was the same as strength. His blue eyes shifted from the rowdy cowboys to the girl, whose gaze never left the ground. She looked like a deer cornered by wolves. For a moment, Carson considered slamming the door. It wasn't his problem. The world was already cruel enough, and he had no room in his life for strangers, least of all one who had been made into a joke. But then Nayeli lifted her head just slightly, and in that brief glance, Carson saw something more than fear. He saw defiance, quiet, desperate, but burning. "Go on," one of the men taunted. "Take her inside. Teach her how a cowboy keeps his house." The others erupted in laughter again. Carson stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden porch. He stopped at the edge, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the fading light. His voice was low but sharp as steel. "You boys ride out of here." Now, the laughter faltered. The men exchanged glances, uncertain whether to push him further. Carson wasn't a man to bluff. He was a man who had survived war, drought, and loneliness, and there was something in his stare that made even drunk cowboys think twice. Reluctantly, they muttered and spat, kicking their horses into motion. One by one, they rode back toward the saloon, their cruel amusement fading into the twilight. When the dust settled, Carson turned back toward Nayeli. She stood, frozen, still, clutching the thin shawl around her shoulders, waiting for the door to close in her face. Instead, Carson stepped aside. "You can come in," he said simply. Her lips parted, as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. She stepped across the threshold slowly, her bare feet whispering against the wooden floor. Inside the house was plain, just a table, a stove, a bed pushed against the wall. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Carson poured her a tin cup of water and set it on the table. "Sit," he said. She obeyed, still silent, her dark eyes fixed on him with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Carson leaned against the wall, arms folded. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted anyone in his house. But as he studied the fragile figure in front of him, he knew one thing for certain. The joke was over, and the men who played it had no idea what they had started. The night settled heavy over the Carson ranch. The prairie crickets sang, coyotes cried in the distance, and the only light inside the cabin came from the flickering fire in the stone hearth. Nayeli sat at the table, her thin hands wrapped around the tin cup of water Carson had given her. Though she had barely taken a sip, her face was half hidden by the shadows, but her eyes, dark, unblinking, never left the man who stood across from her. William Carson felt their weight. He wasn't used to being studied, and certainly not by someone who carried so much quiet sorrow. He rubbed the back of his neck, uneasy. He had faced death on battlefields, buried his own brothers in the hard earth, and endured years of loneliness that gnawed like hunger. Yet this girl, silent and fragile, unsettled him in a way no enemy ever had. He cursed under his breath, pushing away the memory of the men's laughter. His friends, if they could be called that, had humiliated him by sending her here. To them, she was nothing more than a cruel jest, a tool to break the stoic cowboy who refused to join in their drunken games. And Carson had let them. The shame burned deep in his chest. He hadn't stopped them soon enough. He had stood there on the porch while they laughed, watching as the girl was pushed toward his door. He could still hear their mocking voices ringing in his ears. "You can stay the night," he muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, like boots dragging across gravel. "I'll figure out what to do come morning." Nayeli lowered her gaze. The firelight flickered across her cheeks, highlighting the faint scars of a life lived in hardship. She nodded, but said nothing. Carson realized she hadn't spoken a single word since stepping into his house. He moved toward the bed, pulling the blanket loose. "You take this," he said, placing it on the floor near the fire. "It'll be warmer here. I'll sleep by the door." For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes softened, if only slightly, as though surprised by his offer. But she still didn't speak. Carson turned away, pretending not to notice. He wasn't a man for gentle gestures. His life had been one long chain of fights, debts, and dusty trails. Yet, something about this girl stirred a protectiveness he couldn't explain. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be discarded, treated as less than human. Or maybe it was because, beneath the dirt and fear, she carried a kind of dignity that the others had failed to see. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, and Carson found himself staring at the fire until the flames blurred. His mind drifted to the town, to the saloon, where the men were no doubt still laughing. He could almost hear them. Carson, the mighty cowboy, saddled with an Apache bride. What a sight! He clenched his fists. The shame wasn't just for himself, it was for her. They had mocked her existence, her heritage, her womanhood, and by allowing it, he had become part of their cruelty. "Tomorrow," he muttered to himself, "I'll set it right." But deep down, he didn't know what right meant anymore. Sending her back into the cold, leaving her at the mercy of the same men who had used her as a punchline. He shook his head. No, he couldn't do that. He glanced back at her. She was curled beneath the blanket, her small frame trembling though the fire burned hot. For the first time in years, Carson whispered a prayer not for himself, but for the girl fate had forced into his life. Morning would bring questions he didn't yet have the strength to answer. But tonight, as he sat by the door with his rifle across his lap, William Carson knew one truth. The joke had left a stain on his soul, and only honor could wash it clean, and so began the long road that would bind him. To the girl the world had laughed, Atiette, who carried within her the power to change his life forever. The next morning dawned quiet over the open plains. The prairie grass swayed in the cool breeze, and the horizon burned gold with the rising sun. Carson stepped outside with his hat pulled low, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He breathed deep, as if the air itself could clear the shame of last night from his chest. Behind him, the cabin door creaked softly. Naili emerged, still wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. Her dark hair, tangled from sleep, caught the morning light. She stood at the edge of the porch, hesitant, as though unsure if she was welcome. Carson didn't speak at first. He wasn't good with words, and silence was easier than saying the wrong thing. Instead, he handed her a piece of bread from the pantry. She accepted it without a word, her gaze lowered, but her hands trembling slightly as she ate. Hours passed in a rhythm of work. Carson led his horses to the corral, mended a broken fence, and checked the cattle grazing on the open range. He thought the girl might stay inside, but when he turned, he saw her following quietly at a distance, watching every move. Finally, he stopped. "You don't have to trail me," he said. His voice wasn't harsh, just matter-of-fact. She set down the bread crust she'd been nibbling and stepped forward. Without asking, she reached for the wooden bucket by the well and hauled it up, filling the trough for the horses. The effort strained her small frame, but she didn't falter. Carson blinked, surprised. He almost told her to stop, but then he saw the determination in her face. She wasn't following out of fear. She was trying to earn her place. By midday, she had gathered firewood, swept the dust from the cabin floor, and even stitched the tear in one of his work shirts. Every task was done in silence, her hands steady and deliberate. Carson watched her, unsettled. This wasn't the broken, helpless figure the men had mocked. This was someone who had survived with nothing but grit. Later, when the sun dipped low, Carson sat on the porch sharpening his knife. Naili lingered nearby, plaiting strands of grass into a small braid. The prairie stretched before them, mendless, golden, and quiet. It was then Carson finally spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Why didn't you say anything last night?" Naili's fingers stilled. For a long moment, he thought she might ignore him. Then, softly, she answered, in halting English, her accent heavy, but her meaning clear. "They laugh. If I speak, they laugh more." Her words struck like a blow. She hadn't been silent out of weakness, but out of wisdom. She had endured their cruelty in silence because she knew her voice would only feed their cruelty. Carson tightened his grip on the knife handle. Shame flared again, but this time mixed with something else, admiration. "They won't laugh here," he said firmly. Naili looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face, weighing his promise. She didn't smile, but something softened in her expression, a flicker of trust too fragile to name. The prairie winds whispered around them, carrying the faint calls of distant coyotes. The silence that followed was not heavy this time, but gentle like a truce between two lonely souls who had been thrown together by fate as night fell. Carson found himself speaking again. Not much, just a few words about the cattle, the weather, the stars overhead. He wasn't sure if she understood it all, but she listened intently, as if every word mattered. And when he finally fell quiet, Nayeli whispered something back. A single word in her own tongue. He didn't understand it, but the way she said it, steady, almost like a prayer, told him it meant hope. For the first time in years, William Carson felt the weight in his chest ease. The cruel joke that had brought her here was beginning to fade into something else, something neither of them had expected. On the prairie, under the whispering winds, two broken lives had begun to weave together. A week passed on the Carson ranch. The days were long, filled with sweat, dust, and the endless rhythm of work. But for the first time in years, William Carson didn't mind. The silence of his home no longer felt like a tomb. There was another presence, now quiet, but steady, moving like the soft breath of wind through his lonely walls. Nayeli had changed the rhythm of his days. She rose before dawn, helped with the horses, mended what was broken, and carried herself with a dignity that defied her poverty. She spoke little, her English clumsy, but when she did speak, her words were chosen with care. Carson had begun to look forward to those moments. The way her voice seemed to soften the rough edges of the world. Still, he knew whispers were growing in town. Red Rock was small, and small towns had long memories and sharper tongues. He had ignored it as long as he could, but supplies were running low. The ranch needed salt, flour, and nail sand. That meant facing the people who had sent Nayeli to him as a joke that morning. He saddled his horse and turned to her. "We're riding to town," he said. Her eyes flickered with hesitation, but she nodded. She wore a simple dress, one she had mended herself, and wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, as if bracing for a storm. Together, they rode into Red Rock. The town was bustling. As always, wagons creaked down the dirt street. The blacksmith hammered iron, and children darted between the wooden storefronts. But as Carson and Nayeli passed, conversation quieted. Heads turned. Faces smirked. "There he is," someone muttered loud enough for all to hear. Carson and his little Apache bride. Laughter rippled through the street. Men leaned on railings. Women whispered behind gloved hands. And even the children giggled, mimicking the cruel tone of their elders. Nayeli's shoulders stiffened, her gaze dropping to the dirt road. She clutched the reins tighter, every laugh like a knife against her skin. Carson felt the anger rise in him like fire. He dismounted outside the general store, tying his horse with deliberate force. The townsfolk watched with eager eyes, waiting for the scene to unfold. Inside, the storekeeper barely glanced at him. His eyes were fixed on Nayeli. "We don't usually serve her kind here," he said coldly. Carson froze. For a moment, silence filled the shop, broken only by the creak of the floorboards. Then he stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "She's with me," the storekeeper scoffed. "That don't change what she is." In an instant, Carson's hand slammed onto the counter, rattling the jars of penny candy. His eyes blazed, his jaw hard as stone. "Listen well. She's under my roof, my protection. Any man who mocks her mocks me. And I don't take kindly to being mocked." The room went silent. Outside, people pressed against the windows. straining to hear. Nayeli stood behind him, her face pale but her back straight. For the first time, she wasn't shrinking from the stairs. She was standing tall, drawing strength from the man who had chosen to defend her honor in front of the whole town. The storekeeper swallowed, his bluster fading. "Fine," he muttered, fumbling with the ledger. "What do you need?" Carson listed the supplies in a clipped tone, never once breaking his stare. When the goods were packed, he placed the coins on the counter and took Nayeli's hand, not gently, but firmly, a statement to all who were watching. They walked back into the sunlight together. The whispers had died. No one laughed now. The same men who had jeered from the saloon a week earlier looked away as Carson's hard gaze swept across them. Nayeli mounted her horse, her eyes glistening. She said nothing, but when Carson climbed into the saddle beside her, she looked at him with something new, something fragile yet powerful: respect, trust, perhaps even the first spark of something deeper. As they rode out of town, the prairie opened before them once more, wide and endless. Behind them, Red Rock remained small, mean, and petty. But on the open range, they were free. And Carson knew one truth: the world might still laugh, but here, with her, there was no shame, only the beginnings of a bond neither of them had expected. The prairie was no longer quiet. Whispers of unrest spread like wildfire across Red Rock and beyond. The Apache tribes had grown restless, angry at the settlers, angry at the cattle that trampled their hunting grounds, angry at the endless expansion of men who thought the land belonged only to them. The tension was like a storm on the horizon. Though she had been cast aside by her people, she still understood their ways, their pride, their anger. And now, living with Carson, she found herself trapped between two worlds, neither fully belonging to one nor the other. One afternoon, Carson was out mending a fence when he spotted dust rising on the horizon. It wasn't cattle. It wasn't wagons. It was riders. Apache warriors. He cursed under his breath and reached for his rifle, but Nayeli was already at his side. "No," she whispered, her voice urgent. "If you raise weapon, they kill." Her words carried truth, and Carson lowered the rifle reluctantly. The riders drew closer, their painted faces grim, their ponies moving like shadows over the land. They stopped a few yards away, and the leader, a tall man with feathers woven into his braids, pointed straight at Nayeli. "You," he said in Apache, his voice low and hard. "Why are you here? Why do you live with him?" Nayeli's heart hammered in her chest. She understood every word. These were her mother's people, her father's blood. Yet here she stood beside a cowboy, the very kind of man they had been taught to hate. Carson glanced at her, unable to follow their language, but he saw the fear in her eyes. He stepped closer, a silent promise of protection. But this was not a fight he could win with bullets. The Apache leader dismounted, his expression like stone. "If you are one of us, you come now. Leave this ranch. Leave this white man." The world seemed to stop. Nayeli's throat tightened. This was the test, a moment she had dreaded since the night she first crossed Carson's porch. Her tribe offered her a way back, a chance to belong again. But the price was to abandon the man who had given her dignity when the world mocked her. Carson shifted his stance, his hand hovering near his gun belt. He didn't know the words being spoken, but he understood enough. He muttered, "Whatever they're saying." "You don't have to," Nayeli cut him off with a whisper, her eyes locked on the leader. They will not understand. The warriors waited, their faces sharp with judgment. Dust swirled around them as the wind howled across the prairie. Slowly, Naeli stepped forward. For a moment, Carson thought she was leaving him, and the thought tore through him like a knife. But then she spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "I stay." The leader's eyes narrowed. "He is not your blood." Naeli lifted her chin. "Blood did not protect me. He did." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the restless snorts of the ponies. The warriors exchanged glances. Some muttered angrily, but the leader raised a hand to silence them. His expression softened just slightly, touched by her defiance. "You have chosen," he said at last. "Then live with it." Without another word, he mounted his horse and turned away. The others followed, their figures vanishing into the heat and dust of the prairie. Naeli stood rooted to the earth, her body trembling with the weight of what she had done. Carson stepped to her side, his hand brushing her arm. "What happened?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "They asked me to leave," I told them. No, Carson didn't speak. Words felt too small. Instead, he placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his silence carrying more weight than any oath. For the first time, Naeli had chosen, not out of fear, not out of survival, but out of loyalty. The desert had tested her heart, and she had passed. The prairie night was vast and endless, a sea of stars scattered across the heavens. The air carried the faint scent of sagebrush, and the only sound was the crackle of the campfire where Carson sat, his hat tilted back, his rifle laid across his knees. Beside him, Naeli crouched low, feeding small sticks into the fire. The flames lit her face in warm orange, softening the sharp lines of her features. She had not spoken much since the encounter with the Apache warriors, but Carson knew the weight of her decision still hung heavy in her chest. He cleared his throat. Talking never came easy to him, but the silence tonight felt too deep, too heavy. "Back there," he said slowly. "You didn't have to stay. You could have gone with them." Naeli's hands stilled on the wood she held. For a long moment, she didn't reply. Then, in her halting English, she said, "With them, I am nothing. Here, I am seen." The words hit Carson harder than he expected. He thought of the town, the cruel laughter, the eyes that had mocked her. Yet to her, even that was better than being invisible. He looked at her across the firelight and felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. He leaned back, gazing at the sky. "I know what it's like," he muttered, "to be nothing, to be left behind." Naeli tilted her head, listening. Carson's voice grew rough, like gravel dragged across stone. "I fought in the war, lost my brothers to it, came back with nothing but this ranch and ghosts that won't leave me be. Folks in town, they see me as a man with no family, no future, just another cowboy waiting for the grave." He hadn't spoken these words to anyone before. But now, beneath the stars, with this girl beside him, the truth came easier than he expected. Naeli's dark eyes softened. She whispered something in Apache, then repeated in English, "Ghosts leave when you make new fire." She gestured to the campfire between them, the flames glowing bright against the night. Carson studied her, trying to make sense of her meaning. Maybe she was saying that healing didn't come from forgetting the past, but from building something new in the present. The fire crackled. Above them, the Milky Way stretched like a river of light, endless and eternal. For the first time in years, Carson felt small in a way that wasn't crushing, but freeing. He glanced at her again, at the way the starlight kissed her hair, at the strength hidden beneath her quietness. "You're braver than anyone I know," he said quietly. Nayeli shook her head. "Not brave, only tired of running." Carson chuckled softly, a sound so rare it startled them both. "Well," he said, "maybe that's what bravery is." They fell into silence again, but it was no longer the heavy silence of strangers. It was the gentle quiet of two souls who had begun to understand each other. Nayeli laid back on the blanket Carson had spread on the ground, her eyes fixed on the stars above. After a moment's hesitation, Carson did the same, the warmth of her presence close but not touching. The prairie stretched infinite around them. Yet somehow, here by the fire, it felt like the smallest, safest place in the world. "William," she whispered suddenly. Speaking his name for the first time, he turned his head, surprised. "You carry heavy stone here." She touched her chest lightly. "But stone can be broken." Carson's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell her that maybe she was the one breaking it, piece by piece. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he let the silence speak for him. His gaze locked on the endless stars. The night carried on, and for the first time in years, William Carson did not feel alone. Beneath the stars, the cowboy and the Apache bride found something neither had expected, the beginning of healing, and the first fragile spark of love. The morning sun bled red across the horizon, painting the plains in shades of fire. Carson tightened the cinch on his horse's saddle, his jaw set like stone. He had known this day was coming sooner or later. The war between him, the town, and Naila's enemies would spill onto the prairie. Naila stood beside him, her braid falling over her shoulder, her bow slung across her back. She had grown stronger in the weeks since they first met. Her silence had sharpened into resolve, her eyes carrying the weight of someone who had chosen her own path. "They will come," she said quietly. "Both white men and Apache. Neither will let us rest." Carson nodded. "Then we don't wait for we ride out and finish this." By midday, the plains came alive with dust. A posse of ranch hands and drunkards from town thundered across the horizon, rifles gleaming in the sun. And from the opposite ridge, a band of Apache warriors appeared, their faces painted for war, their ponies restless. Nayeli's breath caught. She recognized some of the men cousins, once friends, now enemies bound by pride and blood. The two forces saw each other at the same time, and chaos erupted. Gunshots cracked across the wide-open prairie. Arrows hissed through the air. Horses screamed. The dust turned into a storm of violence. Carson fired his rifle from horseback, taking down a rancher who had once played cards at his table. Rage burned in him, not for himself, but for Nayeli, for the cruelty she had suffered at the hands of both sides. Nayeli rode close to him, loosing arrows with deadly precision. Her face was calm, her movements smooth as water. For the first time, Carson saw her not as a girl sent as a cruel joke, but as a warrior, a force of her own making. A bullet tore through Carson's sleeve, grazing his arm. He gritted his teeth, firing back. Beside him, Nayeli's cousin broke from the Apache ranks, charging straight at her with a tomahawk raised high. Her bow snapped up and the arrow flew true. The man tumbled from his horse, the weapon falling useless to the ground. Her face showed no triumph, only sorrow. The battle raged on. Dust and blood mingled with the cries of the dying. Carson's world narrowed to the sound of his rifle, the pounding of his horse's hooves, and the sight of Nayeli riding beside him, unyielding as the land itself. Finally, as the sun dipped low, the fighting ebbed. The prairie was littered with bodies, white and Apache alike. Those who survived fled into the distance, broken, leaderless, beaten. Carson dismounted slowly, his chest heaving, his shirt stained with sweat and blood. Nayeli slid down from her horse beside him, her bow still in her hand. For a long time they simply stood in the silence, staring at the battlefield that stretched before them. "This is the cost," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "To belong to no one, to choose our own way." Carson looked at her, the setting sun painting her face in firelight. He reached out, his rough hand brushing hers. She did not pull away. Together they walked through the ruin of the battle, side by side. They had fought both worlds, the cruel town that mocked them, and the tribe that cast her aside, and somehow they had survived. But Carson knew this was not the end. Blood had been spilled, and blood had memory. The prairie was not done with them yet. The battlefield had gone silent. The sun bled into the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of crimson and gold. The smoke of gunpowder lingered, carried on the dry wind, and the land seemed to mourn with the cries of distant coyotes. Carson leaned against his saddle, blood seeping from the wound in his arm, his breath heavy. Beside him, Nayeli moved with quiet strength, tending to the horses, gathering what little they had left. She carried no fear, though her eyes carried the sorrow of what they had done, what they had survived. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was thick with all that had been lost. Finally, Carson broke it. His voice was raw, ragged. "They'll never stop, will they?" he said. "Your people. Someone will always come for us." Nayeli looked at him, her face soft in the fading light. "Maybe," she admitted, "but together we are not so easy to break." Carson let out a rough laugh, shaking his head. "You think I'm strong? Truth is, I've been broken for years." She stepped closer, her hand brushing the edge of his shirt where the blood had stained through. "Broken stone still holds the fire," she whispered. Something in her words settled deep in him, a weight lifted. He realized then that Nayeli was not his burden to protect, she was his equal, his flame in the darkness. As the stars began to pierce the twilight, Carson reached into his saddlebag. From it, he pulled a scrap of parchment, the deed to his land. His thumb traced the faded ink of his name, William Carson. He handed the parchment to Nayeli. "You said once you had no place, no name." His eyes searched hers. "If you want it, you can carry mine." Her breath caught. She stared at him, her dark eyes shimmering in the firelight of the dying sun. Slowly, reverently, she reached out and took the parchment. For the first time, she spoke his full name aloud. Nayeli Carson. The sound of it cut through the stillness, sharp as steel, soft as prayer. Carson felt something tighten in his chest. Not pain, but hope. Hope, he thought, he had buried long ago. The night closed around them. They set up camp among the ruins of battle, and when morning came, the prairie stretched before them, vast and unending. They had no family but each other, no home but the land they would build together. Yet somehow it was enough. As they mounted their horses, Nayeli glanced back one last time at the blood-soaked earth where both her people and Carson's had fallen. Her voice was steady. The dust remembers, but so do we, and we ride forward. Carson nodded, his hand brushing hers as they set off. The rising sun cast their shadows long against the plains, side by side, as though written into the land itself. By the time the town would hear of it, whispers would already spread. The cowboy who stood against both worlds, and the Apache bride who carried his last name, not as a joke, not as a shame, but as a vow. Together they vanished into the horizon, where the prairie met the sky. Their story carried on the wind, a tale of fire, blood, and loved forever in the dust of the Old West.